Not in my time, and not in your time, but in a time long ago when pigs ran around with forks already stuck in their arses, asking who wants a slice of ham. There was an old woman who had 3 sons. Now, the first son, his name was Tom, and the second son, his name was Bill, and the third son, well, his name, for lack of a better one, was Jack. Now, Tom, being the eldest, decided he would go out to seek his fortune, and so he said farewell to his mother, and off he went. And he walked, and he walked, and he walked. Walked for 3 days. Walked till he came to a castle, and all along the castle walls were spikes, and on every spike there was a man's head. Not the friendliest place, thought Tom, but maybe I can get some work. And he went up and he knocked on the door. And who should answer the door but a fearsome giant? The giant came out and he looked at Tom and he said, "What are you doing here?" And Tom said, "Well, I've come looking for work, and there's never been a job that I couldn't do." "Is that true?" said the giant. "Yes, boy," said Tom. And the giant said, "Well, if there isn't a job you can't do, I've got a job for you. You come on in and I'll give you a job. And if you can do it, I'll pay you handsomely. But if you can't, well, then I'm going to chop off your head and put it on a spike on the castle wall." And after bragging that there wasn't a job he couldn't do, well, Tom couldn't very well back out. And so he agreed. He shook the giant's hand and he moved on in. Giant gave him some food and put him to bed. And in the morning, Giant woke him up, took him out front and said, "I've got a job for you, Tom." And took him out to the barn. Now, it was a giant barn, and the barn was 7 miles wide and 7 miles deep, and there were 700 cattle in that barn, and it hadn't been cleaned out in 700 years. And he gave Tom a pitchfork, and he said, "Now, Tom, I want you to clean out this barn and have it done by the time I get home. And if you can't, I'm going to chop off your head and put it on a spike on the castle wall." And off goes the giant, the earth shaken underneath his feet. Tom took the pitchfork, and he started to work. And he dug, and he worked as hard as man had ever worked. But he hardly made a dent in the mess in that barn. And at the end of the day, in comes the giant with his axe. And when he sees that Tom hasn't finished the work, he picks up Tom, chops off Tom's head, puts Tom's head on a spike on the castle walls. And that was the end of Tom. And when Tom doesn't come home, Bill, the second eldest, decided he would try his luck. And he said to his mother, farewell, I'm off to seek my fortune." Said goodbye to his mother, and off he went. And he walked, and he walked, and he walked. Walked for 3 days. Walked till he came to a castle. And all along the castle walls were spikes, and on every spike there was a man's head. And one of those heads looked kind of familiar on that day. He went up and he knocked on the door. And who should answer but a fearsome giant? The giant looked down and said, "What are you doing here?" And Bill said, "Well, I've come looking for work, and there's never been a job that I couldn't do." "Is that true?" said the giant. "Yes," said Bill. And the giant gave him the same deal, and Bill shook his hand, accepted, moved in, slept in the giant's bed, ate the giant's food. In the morning, the giant took him out to the barn that was 7 miles wide and 7 miles deep, and handed him the pitchfork and said, "Now, if you can't have this done by the time I get home, I'm chopping off your head and putting it up there beside your brother." Off goes the giant, the earth shaken underneath his feet. And Bill worked even harder than his brother had. At the end of the day, he still had hardly made a dent in the mess in that barn. And so, at the end of the day, in comes the giant with his axe. And there's Bill standing there, and the work not yet completed. And so the giant picks up Bill, chops off Bill's head, and puts it on a spike right up beside his brother. And that was the end of Bill. Now, when Bill doesn't come home, Jack decided he would try his luck. And he said farewell to his mother, and off he went. And he walked, and he walked, and he walked. Walked for 3 days. Walked till he came to a castle. And all along the castle walls were spikes, and on every spike there was a man's head. And 2 of them looked kind of familiar on that day. He walked up and he knocked on the door. And who should answer the door but a fearsome giant? The giant comes out and he looks at Jack and he says, "Cousin Jack, what are you doing here?" And Jack says, "Well, I've come looking for work, and there's never been a job that I couldn't do." "Is that true?" said the giant. "Yes," said Jack. "Well," says the giant, "I've got a job for you. And if you can do it, I'll pay you handsomely. But if you can't, I'm going to chop off your head and put it on a spike up there beside your 2 brothers." Well, after having bragged that there wasn't a job he couldn't do, Jack couldn't very well back out. And so he shook the giant's hand, and he moved into the giant's house. And he slept in the giant's bed. In the morning, the giant woke him up, took him out to that barn that was 7 miles wide and 7 miles deep. And he gave Jack a pitchfork. And he said, "Now, Jack, I want you to clean out this barn and have it done by the time I get home tonight. And if you can't, I'm going to chop off your head and put it on a spike." "Yes," says Jack. Out goes the giant, the earth, shaken underneath his feet. Now Jack takes the pitchfork and he starts to dig, and he dug and he dug and he dug. He dug for about 7 minutes. And he realized there was no way under heaven that he was going to finish a job that day. And he thought if this was going to be his last day on earth, he wasn't going to spend it working. And so he took the pitchfork and he shoved it down in the manure, and he went out of that barn and he found a beautiful tree. And he sat down under the tree and he lazed around and he fell asleep. And when he woke up, who should be standing there but a beautiful girl? A beautiful girl with a beautiful smile and a beautiful dress and flowers in her hair. "Hi, Jack," she said. "Hi," he said, "who are you?" And she said, "I'm Nan. I'm the giant's daughter. What's my father got you doing today?" And Jack says, "Well, I got to clean out his barn. And if I can't have it done by the time he gets home, he says he's going to chop off my head and put it on a spike." "Yes," said Nan, "he likes to do that." Now, Nan kind of liked the look of Jack's head and didn't want to see it separated from his body. And so she said, "Jack, what did my father give you to do it with?" And Jack said, "Oh, he gave me a pitchfork." "Ah, Jack," she said, "a pitchfork will never work." Now, Nan was wearing an apron, and she reached down into that apron of hers, and she pulled out a little tiny silver fork, and she laid it down into Jack's hand. And Jack looked at the silver fork, and he looked at Nan, and he said, "Nan, there's no way a little fork is going to work where a pitchfork doesn't." And she said, "Trust me, Jack. Just go and try." So Jack took the little fork, and he went out, and he stuck it down into the manure, and as soon as he did, it started to dig. And it dug, a magic fork, and before you knew it, manure was flying out every door and window, and before too long, the entire barn was cleaned out, as clean as a whistle. And Nan walked across the floor. She picked up the little fork, and she cleaned it off, and she put it back down into her apron. Then her and Jack, they talked, and they talked, and they talked all day long. And then the earth started to shake underneath their feet. And Nan said, "That's my father. He's coming home, and you can't tell him that I was the one to help you, because if he does, he'll chop off both of our heads." "I promise," said Jack. Out runs Nan. In comes the giant with his axe, ready to cut off Jack's head. And there's Jack standing there grinning with the pitchfork in his hand and the barn all cleaned out. And the giant looked around, and he said, "You've been talking to my daughter Nan. I don't know nothing about no daughter Nan," said Jack, and he glared right back at the giant. And the giant said, "Well, you best come up to the house, and I'll feed you." Took him up to the house, gave him some food, sent him to bed. In the morning, the giant woke Jack up, and he said, "Now, Jack, I've got a second job for you today." Took Jack out in front of the house. Now, out in front of the house, there was a pond. It was a giant pond. It was 7 miles wide and 7 miles deep. And he gave Jack an old bucket, and he said, "Now, Jack," he says, "I want this pond bailed out by the time I get home tonight. And if you can't do it, I'm going to chop off your head and put it on a spike up on the castle walls." "Yes," says Jack. Off goes the giant, the earth, shaken underneath his feet. And Jack took the bucket, and he dipped it down into the water, and he tossed the water to one side. And he did that once, he did it twice, he did it 7 times. And he realized there was no way he was ever going to be able to finish that job. And if this was going to be his last day on earth, he wasn't going to spend it working. And so he took the bucket and he laid it down by the marge of the pond. He went back and he found that tree, and he sat down under the tree, lazed around, and fell asleep. And when he woke up, who should be standing there but that beautiful girl? That beautiful girl with the beautiful smile and the beautiful dress and the flowers in her hair. "Hi, Jack," she said. "Hi, Nan. What's my father got you doing today?" "Oh, I got to clean out the pond." "What did he give you to do it with?" "Old bucket," said Jack. "Oh, Jack," she said, "that'll never work." She reached down into her apron, and she took out a little silver spoon and laid it down into Jack's hand. Jack looked at the spoon and looked at the pond, and he said, "A little spoon isn't going to work, or a great big bucket doesn't." And she said, "Trust me, Jack." So Jack took the little spoon, went over and dipped the spoon down into the water. And it was a magic spoon, and it started to bail out that pond all by itself. And before too long, the pond was empty, as dry as a bone, just a few trout flapping on the bottom where the water used to be. Nan walked across the bottom of that pond, picked up the spoon, cleaned it off, put it back down into her apron. Then her and Jack talked, and they talked, and they talked, and they talked. They talked all day until the earth started to shake underneath their feet. "Jack," she said, "that's my father. You can't tell him that I was the one to help you. I won't, said Jack. Off runs Nan. In comes the giant with his axe, ready to cut off Jack's head. And there's Jack standing there grinning with the bucket in his hand and the pond all cleared out. And the giant looked at Jack and he said, "You've been talking to my daughter Nan. I don't know nothing about no daughter Nan," says Jack, and he glares right back at the giant. And the giant said, "Well, best come up to the house and I'll feed you." Took him up, gave him some food, and sent him to bed. On the third day, the giant woke up Jack. And the giant had a smile on his face this day. And he said, "Now, Jack, I've got a job for you that no one has ever been able to do. And if you can do it today, I'll pay you, and pay you handsomely. But if you can't, I'm going to chop off your head." He took Jack out. And there in front of the house, there was a pole, a Glassen Pole. And he said to Jack, "Now, all you got to do is climb the Glassen Pole and get down the black flag from the top." And Jack looked up, and there, fluttering in the breeze, the top of the Glassen Pole was a flag, all of black. Jack thought, this is the easiest job of all. And off goes the giant, the earth shaking underneath his feet. Jack went over to the Glassen Pole, and he tried to climb up it, but it was made of glass, so he'd get up so far, and then he'd slide back down again. He took a firmer grip on the pole, and he went up maybe a few more inches, but again, he slid right back down. Jack looked around for a stick long enough to knock down the black flag or a ladder of some kind, but there was nothing. And he started to think that maybe this was a difficult job after all. And there he was, standing underneath the Glassen Pole, when who should come along but that beautiful girl. The beautiful girl with the beautiful smile and the beautiful dress and the flowers in her hair. "Hi, Jack," she said. "Hi, Nan. What's my father got you doing today?" "I got to get down the black flag from the top of the Glassen Pole." And Nan looked right solemn at this. "Oh, Jack," she said, "that's the hardest job of all. And I can tell you how to do it, but you have to agree to do exactly what I tell you." "Sure," said Jack. "No," she said, "Jack, this is serious. You have to swear on your heart that you'll do everything I say." "All right," said Jack. And he swore in his heart that he'd do whatever Nan told him to do. Nan reached down into that apron of hers, and she pulled out a little pair of silver scissors. And she laid the silver scissors down into Jack's hand. And Jack looked at the silver scissors and looked up at the Glassen Pole and the black flag. And he said, "Now, Nan, I don't see how a little pair of silver scissors are going to help me." And she said, "Jack, this is where you have to listen and do exactly what I tell you. You see, you take those silver scissors and you cut off all of my fingers. And you take one of my fingers and you stick it on the side of the Glassen Pole. It'll grow out into a branch. You climb up onto that branch, you take another finger, reach up as high as you can, stick it on the Glassen Pole, it'll grow out into another branch. You work your way all the way up, using all my fingers and thumbs. You grab the black flag and you come back down. You break off the branches, they'll turn into fingers. And when you get back on the ground, you can put them back on my hands." "Well, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard," said Jack. "There's no way I'm doing that." And she said, "Oh, Jack, you swore on your heart, and it's the only way." And she held up her little white fingers. And Jack took the silver scissors, and one at a time he started to snip off Nan's fingers. And he took the bloody stumps of those fingers and he put them down into his pockets. And he went over to the Glassen Pole. He reached into his pocket and he pulled out the first finger and he stuck it on the side of the Glassen Pole. And just like Nan had said, it grew out into a beautiful branch. And he climbed up onto that branch. He reached down his pocket, he took another finger, he reached as high as he could, he stuck it on the side of the Glassen Pole, and it grew out into another branch. He worked his way all the way up to the top of the Glassen Pole, using all her fingers and thumbs. And he reached out to grab a hold of the black flag, but when he did, he looked out towards the horizon and he saw the giant coming home early. And he called down the Glassen Pole. "Nan," he said, "your father's coming. Well, hurry up, Jack, and break off the branches as you come." And so he stuffed the black flag down into his shirt, and he started to climb down the Glassen Pole. He broke off the first branch, and sure enough, it shrunk back down to a little finger. And the next one, he worked his way all the way down, collecting all those fingers and thumbs. And he got to the bottom, and there was Nan waiting for him. "Jack," she said, "hurry up, my father's coming now." And he took the first finger and he stuck it back on her hand, and it grew back, right like that. And then the second, and the third, but by now the earth was starting to shake underneath their feet. "Jack," she said, "you gotta hurry. I gotta run away. I gotta run away now." And she ran away so fast that Jack was left with one little finger. He took the finger and he hid it down in his pocket. And in comes the giant with his axe, ready to cut off Jack's head. And Jack's there standing at the bottom of the Glassen Pole with the black flag in his hands. And the giant knew that he was beat. And he said, "Best come up to the house, Jack," he said, "and I'll think of a way to pay you." And he took Jack up to the house. Now, when he got there, he said, "All right, Jack," he said, "I've decided that in payment, you can marry one of my daughters. And I don't care which one it is, but you're not allowed to talk to any of them before you make your decision." And that suited Jack fine. He knew exactly which one he was going to pick. So the giant called out for his first daughter, and in came that beautiful girl with the beautiful smile and the beautiful dress and the flowers in her hair. And she came out and she stood beside her father and she smiled at Jack, and Jack smiled right back at her. And then the giant called for his second daughter, and in came a beautiful girl with a beautiful smile and a beautiful dress and flowers in her hair. And she came out and stood beside her sister, and she looked exactly the same. And she smiled at Jack, and Jack kind of smiled at her. And then the giant called for his third daughter, and in came a beautiful girl with a beautiful smile and a beautiful dress and flowers in her hair. And she came out and stood beside her identical sisters, and she smiled at Jack, and Jack didn't have a clue which one of them to smile back at. And the giant said, "Now, Jack," he said, "make your choice. And I don't care which one you pick, but you're not allowed to talk to any of them." And Jack looked at the first daughter and the second and the third, and he had no idea which one to pick. And then he noticed that the third daughter was kind of wiggling her hand, and he looked down and saw that she only had 3 fingers and a thumb on that one hand, and he said, "That's the daughter I pick." "Fair enough," said the giant. "And you can have her in the morning, and good riddance to the two of you. Now off you go to bed." And so off went Jack, and he sent the daughters away. Then the giant went to his wife, and he said, "I hates that Jack," because Jack had picked Nan, and Nan was his favorite daughter. And he said, "There's no way I'm letting him leave with her in the morning. I'm going to go up and I'm going to kill him where he sleeps." Now Nan was around the corner, listening to what her father had said. And she ran to Jack and she said, "Jack," she said, "my father aims to kill you tonight, and I can help you get away. Do you trust me?" And Jack said, "Yes, of course I do." And she said, "All right, Jack," she said, "give me your hand." And Jack held out his hand. And Nan reached down into that wonderful apron of hers, and she took out a little silver pin. And she took Jack's hand and she drove the pin down into the center of Jack's hand until a pool of blood welled up in his palm. And she collected up Jack's blood. And she said, "All right, Jack," she said, "now run away, and run away as fast as you can. Don't look behind you. Just promise me you'll come back 1 year from today. By then my father will have forgotten everything. And then I can come away with you. Because if I leave with you now, he'll know it was me and he'll track us both down." "All right," says Jack. And Jack moves to leave, and she says, "Jack, aren't you going to kiss me before you go?" And Jack says, "S'pose." And he goes over and he gives her a great big kiss on the face. And she says, "Now, Jack, don't go kissing another living soul until you kiss me 1 year from today." "I promise," said Jack. "I swear on my heart I won't kiss another living soul." And off runs Jack. And he ran and he ran and he ran as man had never run before. Now Nan still had Jack's blood. She went into the kitchen and she baked up 7 loaves of bread. And she took a little bit of blood and she put it on the first loaf, and a little bit of blood on the second, on the third, on the fourth, on those 7 loaves of bread. And then she picked up the loaves and she went out to the staircase that went up to Jack's room, and she put 1 loaf of bread on the first stair and another loaf of bread on the second, the third, the fourth, all the way up with the 7 loaves of bread. And then she went to bed herself. The giant waited until midnight, till he thought that everyone would be asleep. And he picked up his axe and he went back out, and he was just about to go up the staircase when he thought that Jack, being so clever, having solved all those impossible tasks, maybe Jack was waiting for him at the top of the stairs. And so he calls up and he said, "Jack, are you asleep yet?" And the first loaf of bread answered with Jack's voice and said, "No, I'm not asleep yet. Go back to bed." And that's what the giant did. He took his axe and he went back to bed, and he laid there in his bed, his wife on one side, the axe on the other. He waited for an hour. And he came back out and he called up the stairs, "Jack, are you asleep yet?" And the second loaf of bread answered in Jack's voice and said, "No, boys, not asleep yet. Go back to bed." And so that's what he did. He did that 7 times, and each time a different loaf of bread would answer in Jack's voice. And the 8th time, as the sun was starting to come up in the east, he called up the stair and there was no answer. And so he crept up the stairs. He opened up the door, he jumped into the room, and he brought the axe down on Jack's bed. But Jack was long gone at that point. And the giant searched everywhere. But Jack had such a head start that the giant was never able to find out where Jack had gone. Now Jack ran and ran and ran. He ran for 3 days and 3 nights. He ran all the way back to his mother's house. And there, waiting for him, outside the door of his mother's house, was his little dog. And the little dog was so happy to see Jack coming home that the dog ran up to meet him, ran up, jumped up into Jack's arms, and gave Jack a great kiss across the face. And as soon as Jack got that kiss from another living soul, he forgot everything that had ever happened to him, forgot his own name. And from that day forth, he just sat on a little stool and was no good to nobody for nothing. And a year passed. And Nan was waiting for Jack to come back, and when he didn't, Nan decided she would take matters into her own hands, and she got a bag and she filled it up with as much gold and silver as she could carry. And then she went out into the great wide world looking for Jack. The only thing was, she had no idea where Jack lived, and she wandered for 7 years until she came to a house. And there was a boy sitting on a stool by the door who looked familiar, but when she spoke to him, he did not answer. And so she went into the house and she said to the old woman who lived there, "Who's the boy sitting on the stool outside?" And she said, "Oh, that's my son Jack. And he went away many years ago, but when he came back, he had forgotten everything, forgotten how to speak, forgotten his own name." And Nan said, "Can I go talk to him?" And the old woman said, "You can talk to him, but he won't answer you." "That's fine," said Nan. Nan went outside, and there was Jack on the stool, and there were chickens all around. And Nan reached down to that wonderful apron of hers, and she pulled out some chicken feed, and she started to feed the chickens. And she told the chickens a story. She told the chickens a story about a boy who had come to her father's house to clean out the barn that was 7 miles wide and 7 miles deep, and how the only thing he used was a little silver fork. And when she'd finished the story, Jack spoke for the first time in many years. He said, "I've heard that story before." "Really?" said Nan. "I'll tell you a second story." And she told the chickens and Jack a second story, a story about the boy who came to her father's house to clean out the pond that was 7 miles wide and 7 miles deep, and how the only thing he used was a little silver spoon. When she finished the story, Jack said, "I think I've heard that story before too." "Really?" said Nan. "I'll tell you a third story." And she told Jack the story of the boy who came to climb the Glassen Pole to get down the black flag, and how he used a little pair of silver scissors to cut off all of her fingers. And when Jack heard that story, he said, "I've heard that story before." He said, I think that boy might have been me." And then he reached down into his pocket, and way down at the bottom of the pocket where it had been for all those years, he pulled out a dried up little bone. And Nan held up her hand, and Jack took the little bone and touched it to the skin, and her finger grew back. And when Nan was whole once more, Jack remembered everything that had ever happened to him. And he took Nan into his arms, and he went back in and introduced her to his mother. Now, Jack's mother was overjoyed to see Jack returned to his senses. And she was doubly overjoyed to see that he had brought home this beautiful, resourceful young woman, and she was triply overjoyed to see that that young woman had a bag full of silver and gold. And so it was decided that the two of them should be married, and a day for the wedding was set, and the day for the wedding arrived, and people came from miles around, and they had a grand feast with 7 kinds of cabbage and 7 kinds of cake, and they laid out all that food on a great tin table. But the tin table bended, and so my story is ended. And if the table had been stronger, this story would have been longer.